to some new friends, old friends, and people I don't know. It's always a good mix, and students from yeshiva as well. It's really an excellent blend of people I'm seeing up on my screen here. And it's wonderful to be able to get together to learn with you. It's a double whammy in terms of the world that we live in. Uh-oh. Can't hear me. That's not good.
Hear you fine, Rabbi.
I'm fine? You. Okay, yes, good. So those who hear can tell the people who don't hear. Hopefully everybody will be able to. Hopefully everybody will be able to do it. But in the meantime, it's a double whammy. It's a lunch and learn without lunch, and it's a book reception without books. So it's kind of like an amazing. But at least we have the shiur. The class goes on. That's the way that these things. That's the way that these things go. In a healthier world, we would have had a book reception to celebrate Cornerstones. I'll hold it up just for the sake of making it feel like a celebration of the new publication. I want to thank those who participated in sponsoring the book and in its distribution. So thank you all. It's available on Amazon like everything else, and it contains a series of essays pertaining to the ideology of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. I'm the national scholar there. This class is sponsored by the Institute. The Institute is really an incredibly vital organization. We have reached so many thousands of people in so many ways through our classes, programs, teacher trainings, our publications, our website. And all of you who are members, supporters, thank you, because without you, we really could not do any of that. Whereas those who are not yet members, please go online to jewishideas.org, our website, and let me just make sure that I'm saying hello to everybody instead of private. Hold on. Just to learn more about our organization and the values that we are promoting, what we do, and how you can get involved, because that would be great. You'll receive our journal conversations. You will be able to, be plugged into all of our different teachings, publications, and the things that are going on. A lot is happening. And particularly in a COVID era, we've been able to reach people all over the world and bring teaching and inspiration in a way that I'm really grateful to be able to participate in that. Usually when we talk about Israel in the public discourse, it's referring to modern Israel, which is a good thing to talk about. Usually it can be talked about in productive and responsible ways, but very often it is not, whether by politicians, the media, academics, whatever it is. Sometimes people do an excellent job presenting a balanced and honest picture, and sometimes people have quite the agenda one way or the other. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I have things to say, I'm sure, but this is really just a straight up purists Tanakh shiur. Let me just respond to the. Okay, that's the name of the book. I'm a Tanakh person in general. I'm very into the biblical scene. I'm interested in what are the ideas that actually emerge from the Bible. And I find that very often even educated Jews don't necessarily spend enough time focusing on that. And that's really the heart and soul of where, everything builds out of that. In this particular case, I'll tell you, I've been learning Tanakh for some time and I've been teaching it for some time. But it's only very recently that I thought about, well, what is the meaning of Israel from a biblical perspective? The setting of so many stories happens to be in Israel, but that's usually how I think about it. I think of it as a setting. I don't think of it as, okay, but what's its meaning? So this three-part series is really geared entirely on culling various verses and rabbinic interpretations on what is the meaning of the land of Israel within Tanakh itself. Some points might be very self-evident, but you got to mention those also in the context of being thorough. Some are a little counterintuitive from what normally goes on out there. So that's what we're going to try to do in a three-part series, and it's very easy to organize a three-part series like this. Today will be the Torah, and next week will be the prophets. And the third week will be the Second Temple period and just some bigger ideas about the whole thing. Got to keep it simple and organized. So that's how we're going to do that. And so without further ado, let's march. If you have any comments at any point, we have the chat function. As all my Beit Midrash of Teaneck people know, I refer to that conversation as traffic. So what I usually do, it actually is a great way to manage a big crowd. You can talk, and then when there's a good moment to pause, I could look over at the traffic and see what's happening over there and respond, and we'll pace it accordingly. Okay, first thing that's just important to be aware of from a biblical point of view is that the Torah's story does not begin in the land of Israel. That is, I can't emphasize that point. And it doesn't begin with our people. And it begins with Adam and Eve, who are our ancestors, like everybody else's ancestors. But it's not a Judeo-centric or Israel-centric perspective at all. The Garden of Eden, it's not clear where it is, but it's not in the land of Israel. It's somewhere yonder off to the east, maybe some Mesopotamian zone. But wherever it might be, it's not Jerusalem, it's not Hebron, it's not any of these places. That's important, that the Torah is trying to set out a two-tiered system, which is relevant both to people and to places, which is that the Torah very much cares about the entire world, not just the people of Israel. We have no privileged place to start with. The land of Israel is not a privileged space over any other space. These things become important. The people of Israel become important, and the land of Israel becomes important only through the covenant that God strikes between God strikes with the patriarchs. That suddenly triggers specialness and chosenness. And that deserves its own talk, which we actually did via the Institute a couple of months ago. You can go to our YouTube channel and just search my name, I guess at this point is the best way to go. You'll find those classes that we did back in October. So that's just point number one. Point number two is once God does choose Abraham, then suddenly the land of Israel becomes really important. And God never seems to tire of promising the land to Abraham and his descendants. So sources 1, 2, 3, and 4 just do that. I'll read them in English. You have them in front of you, I hope. The Lord appeared to Avram and said, I will assign this land to your heirs. That's right after Abraham arrived in the land of Israel. God immediately promises him this land to his heirs. And he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Okay. If you know the basic story of Genesis, you know that Abraham doesn't have any children for a long time. And that creates a problem in his mind, which is who exactly are these heirs supposed to be? So Abraham goes through this filtering process of guessing what God has in mind. It starts out with his nephew, whose name is Lot. Lot is there. Abraham brings him along for the ride, presumably as his putative heir. But then Lot makes this fatal error in choosing to live in the city of Sodom, which is a wicked city then, and it's a destroyed city ever since. So in source number 2, after Lot chooses to leave, God reiterates the promise. The Lord said to Abraham, after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. For I give all the land that you see to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted. Up, walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. So God has to reiterate this covenant to Abraham now that Lot is gone, because who are the heirs? Abraham goes on through the process of trying to adopt a servant whose name is Eliezer, but God says, no, you're going to have a child. So after that block, in source number 3, God does what's called the Brit Ben Abtarim in Hebrew, or the covenant between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I assign the land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. That's already the third time in a relatively scant narrative where there are other things going on, but God never tires of promising this land to Abraham and his descendants. The fourth promise, however, is different from the first 3. And this is where God commands, first of all, he changes Abraham's name to Abraham, but he also commands Brit Milah, the circumcision. This is the moment where, for the very first time, God tells Abraham that you too and your descendants have a responsibility in this covenant. Up until now, it's been a gift. God is saying, the land is mine. I'm giving this land to you and your descendants, or specifically to your descendants. But for the first time, God is saying, but now you have to do something to earn the land. It starts off with the Brit Milah, circumcision, and later on that's going to evolve into the entire Torah, that the people of Israel will have to be faithful to God's covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. So source 4 brings out this mutual covenant side of it. I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, to be God to you and to your offspring to come. I assign the land you sojourn in to you and your offspring to come, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding. I will be their God. So here we have different features of the covenant that we did not have in sources 1, 2, and 3. So let's just focus on them for a second. First of all, it focuses on the chosen people mutual covenant aspect of things. It focuses on just the monotheistic component of it, which is a given in the Tanakh, but here God stresses that more. And most importantly, that the land of Israel is not just a gift, but rather it's part of the covenant. And we also hear one other line, that this is an everlasting covenant for the people of Israel. I mean, there's no such thing as the people of Israel yet. We're still talking to Abraham. Israel is, whoa. Okay, I don't know what just happened, but please. Hello. I just got thrown out by something. Okay, this is all good. I'm glad you hear me, but it's just, okay, there's just stuff in the background that just happened. Okay, in the meantime, let's get back over to here. I have to move this over and then I'm ready to talk again. I'm sorry for the delay. There's just some interference on my screen. Okay, now we're done. And I'm going to go back to everyone, and I think we are good. Okay. Good. That the land of Israel is essential to the God-Israel covenant. That's something which is new in this capacity, and it's something which we are going to focus on as we go down the line. What the passage also says, which is interesting, we already get a tip-off as to what the rest of biblical history is about. You see here that the land of Canaan, or what we call the land of Israel, is everlasting holding for Abraham's descendants. If I didn't know better, if I don't know the other 23 books of Tanakh, it sounds like the people of Israel will dwell in this land and never leave it. That's what everlasting holding you think means, right? It doesn't mean that, as we learn from the rest of biblical history. What it means is this: this land always will belong to your people, whether or not you are in the land. If down the line there is an exile, the land still belongs to the people of Israel. Israel never relinquishes this divine title for the land, but it doesn't mean, it's not a divine promise, as we see from the whole rest of the Bible, that your descendants will always live in the land of Israel. And that's critical for understanding everything that happens from the Torah through the rest of biblical history. And that's something that we will go for. Another thing that's critical here, by the way, is that all of these passages that we've looked at are passages where God promises something to, something is happening here. I apologize. Okay. Hold on one second. I'm just going to put the source sheet on. I'm sorry for somebody interfered with my screen, and now it's difficult to do what I would like to do. I apologize for all of that, but we will make it all work. Hold on.
Click on the little thing that says Israel 1 PDF that's next to message, right below your dummy, the little person with a head and the shoulders. Right below that, there's a thing that says Israel 1 PDF.
Israel 1 PDF. I know what you're talking about. I know this screen. My screen is just doing wonky things because somebody put something up on the screen, which
it looks like Irene Lancaster shared the screen. She's sharing a screen.
Okay, Irene, can you please stop screen sharing? If you're out there, please stop screen. I apologize for the technical delay here, but this is actually just preventing me from being able to manage this. Hold on. Okay, now I'm helping myself here. This is good. Okay. Now I'm going to share screen myself and share. And now we got it. Okay, ta-da. Because now we are where we need to be. I now suddenly have to get chat back available because right now the screen is doing stuff, but at least this is much better. So hold on, chat, okay. Okay, now hopefully we'll be able to march forward without further ado. At first, these passages are all to Abraham, and therefore it sounds like all of Abraham's descendants will inherit the land of Israel. It's the rest of the book of Genesis that refines that process, where we find out that of Abraham's 8 sons, only one of them is part of this land of Israel covenant, and that is, of course, Isaac. And then Isaac has 2 sons, but we find out that it ends up being through Jacob only. So that's what the rest of the book of Genesis sets out. And God reiterates the covenant to Isaac and to Jacob, not in the source sheets, but throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, there's a clear refining process that even though other family members of Abraham will get other territories, such as Lot's children, Ammon and Moab, well, that's Ammon and Moab, the nations that emerged from Lot, they received territory east of the Jordan River. And likewise, the descendants of Esau or Esav, he receives the territory of Edom that belongs to him as part of the Abrahamic covenant. But the land of Israel proper, that we know as the land of Israel, that goes to the descendants only of Jacob. That's the way that this covenant works through the rest of the book. Okay. One other feature of the God-Abraham covenant is source number 5, right after the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We have here in source 5, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your favored one, I bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore. And your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. This is the only time that God swears the land. It's not new content. What matters here is that we have a divine oath. And so this is the contribution of the Akedah. It sounds like because Abraham was willing to do the ultimate act of faith here. So this clinched the language of oath, which later biblical writers use a lot. They appeal to the divine oath. Whenever they're appealing to it, that always goes back to this story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, because it's the only place where God officially swears the land to Abraham and his descendants. Okay, so part one of this is that the land of Israel becomes a divine gift to the patriarchs and their descendants. It is a central aspect of the God-Israel covenant down the line. And it sounds like Abraham's passing the test of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is what seals the deal, so to speak. That's what we have in part A. Okay, so far so good. Part B is, even though the land itself will go to the people of Israel only after we know the story, the Israelites have to go down to Egypt and they're enslaved, then the Exodus, then they cross the desert. It's only in the time of Joshua that they finally inhabit the land. But there are little tidbits that become part of our family's heritage before that Joshua story. And that begins in source number 6. When Sarah dies, Abraham realizes, great, I have this divine covenant of the whole land, but right now I have no burial place for my wife. I can't wait for my descendants in hundreds of years to show up. I need to bury her now. And so he needs to purchase land, and he realizes that. So source 6, then Abraham rose from beside his dead and spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am a resident alien among you. Even though he's divinely bequeathed the entire land 4 times over by this point in the narrative, it doesn't matter. 5 times over, actually. It doesn't help him today. So he has to go ahead and he feels like a resident alien because he is. Sell me a burial site among you that I may remove my dead for burial. Let him sell me the cave of the Machpelah that he owns, which is at the edge of his land. Let him sell it to me at the full price for burial site in your midst. And so this man named Ephron sells him this field and cave for 400 shekalim, 400 shekel. The average salary back in the good old days for a hardworking man was between 6 and 8 shekalim a year. So we're talking about 40 years of income to buy this. So even though Ephron is talking, oh, you can have it. We're all friends here. It's all great. This would have been an astonishing fortune for a relatively small piece of land. But Abraham was willing to do it because he didn't want any questions over this purchase. He wanted everybody to know that even though he is not a Hittite, he's a foreigner legally, he has title to this land. The Torah never tires of reminding us of this purchase. And throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, time and again, this purchase is mentioned as a way of saying, we legitimately own this cave in Hebron and the field, the adjacent field, because Abraham bought it fair and square. There's one other land purchase that our ancestors take into account before Joshua shows up, and that's in source 7, when Jacob is already on the scene with his family back from Lavan's house. Jacob arrived safe in the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, having come thus from Padan Aram, and he encamped before the city. The parcel of land where he pitched his tent, he purchased from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 kesitahs. He set up an altar there and called it El Elohei Yisrael. So there's some parcel of land in the city of Shechem where Yaakov purchased it, Jacob purchases it, and this becomes the first piece of land that our family owns for the living. Hebron was owned for the dead. It was a burial site, but this is the first piece of land that was bought for the living. And so sure enough, this sale also is reiterated on several occasions, biblically speaking, because the Bible realizes, wow, these are our first land, Hebron and Shechem. The only other big real estate purchase that we see much later on is that of King David. Even though he conquered Jerusalem, he still wanted to purchase Temple Mount. And so in source number 8, as it's reported, the formulation in the book of Chronicles, the very late book, but King David replied to Ornan, he's a Canaanite who's selling him this field, no, I will buy them at the full price. And the Hebrew is Bechesef Maleh, which is the same expression that Abraham used in source number 6. I cannot make a present to the Lord of what belongs to you or sacrifice burnt offering that has cost me nothing. King David feels he has to buy this property, and so he does. So David paid Ornan for the site 600 shekels worth of gold, also a lot of money, especially for a conquered person. He could have taken it for free. He was the king, but all the same, he didn't. He wanted it to be a fair and square thing. This would be the place where the temple would be built. So these are the 3 land purchases that make it into the family like this: the burial site in Hebron, a parcel of land in the city of Shechem, Temple Mount. There was one other place that was also purchased, and that is the city of Shomron, Samaria. The king Omri purchased it. It's not in our source sheets. So those are the 4 places. Those 4 places all became capitals in biblical Israel later on. Hebron was King David's first capital. Shechem was the northern kingdom's first capital. Jerusalem was the capital. It was King David's capital after he moved from Hebron, and that became the capital of the south. And Samaria became the capital of the northern kingdom. So our Bible is very interested in these 4 places that our family purchased. Even though we have the whole land from God, there's still this sense of whatever we bought with money, we have to make sure that there is a clean record of that. Nobody should ever challenge those purchases. And so that's important to understand from the context of how Abraham thinks about the world, which is that he is a resident alien. Until now, we have the book of Genesis, and we're going to move on to the rest of the Torah for just a moment. Let me just see what's happening in the traffic. Oh, lots of things. So let me see this. Okay. Eretz Yisrael, to be an everlasting holding for Abraham's descendants. This parallels the Davidic line, which is also not necessarily continuous. Excellent parallel, Charlie, absolutely. From where do we know that an average income was 6 to 8 shekalim in those days? Just from outside scholarship. It doesn't say this in Tanakh itself. You're absolutely right in asking that. But other documents from that period suggest that it was 6 to 8 shekalim is a decent salary. There's one fellow, even we have a Levite in the book of Judges, who's given room and board and 10 shekels a year. And that's a salary. So the idea of 400 shekel at that point sounds like an exorbitant figure. Was Abraham's purchase of a plot for Sarah a test from Hashem to see if he would do it in Israel? I don't know. God doesn't present it as a test, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't one. I just do not know. Is it a foregone conclusion that all of the children of Jacob will get the land, or only because Joseph of his free will decides to forgive the brothers? The way the divine promise runs, the answer is no, it's a foregone conclusion. It sounds like God is bequeathing this land to the people of Israel from the get-go, and that's it. It happens that it's a good idea that Joseph reconciles with his brothers, because otherwise I don't know what would happen with the story. It would have continued to be a mess generation after generation. Is the Brit Milah, with its ability to produce Abraham's seed, the necessary textual and physical link that allows and establishes the promise of the land to Abraham's offspring? It certainly might be related. It depends, of course, on the meaning of why we circumcise our males, which the Torah does not offer a reason for that. There are plenty of reasons suggested by later commentators, but the Torah itself does not make that meaning explicit. So it could be, that's speculative. Why is the David purchase not noted till Chronicles, not in Shmuel? It is noted in Shmuel, by the way. Thank you for raising that question. The reason why I'm mentioning the Chronicles formulation is only because the author of Chronicles wanted to parallel the language to that of Abraham, Bechesef Maleh. But David does buy the Temple Mount from the same guy in the book of Samuel as well. It's the very last chapter of the book of Samuel, as a matter of fact. You can look it up. It's 2 Samuel chapter 24. Okay, so that covers the covenant with the patriarchs. And up until now, it doesn't sound like the land of Israel is contingent on anything. You read the rest of the Torah and you start seeing the other side of the covenantal relationship, beginning with source number 9. This is in the chapter of prohibited sexual relations. God takes sexual morality very, very seriously, and there are all kinds of laws with severe consequences for people who violate them. And after giving a litany of prohibitions, the Torah then says in source 9, do not defile yourselves in any of those ways. For it is by such that the nations that I am casting out before you defiled themselves. Thus the land became defiled. I called it to account for its iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants. It's a fabulous formulation. The idea here is that the land of Israel itself demands holiness. And if people act in an unholy way, the land of Israel gets sick and throws up. It's a very potent imagery, and it's one that really describes how the rest of the Bible runs. That God in the temple and the land of Israel itself simply cannot tolerate impure, unholy behavior. And here's something which is also very, very important. There are all kinds of laws of ritual purity in the book of Leviticus. And they deal with the purification of the temple. First, the tabernacle, the moving shrine that they built in the desert. But those laws also apply to the temple once there was a permanent shrine in Jerusalem. The idea is that God's home becomes defiled when people sin or through various physical impurities. Okay? But God created a purification system. There's what's called the Korban Chatat, or the purification offering. And there's also Yom Kippur is really the ultimate of that. It's 1 day per year where they purify the entire temple. There's a whole ritual, and that's what it's for. The idea of purifying the temple is God knows that we are imperfect, but God wants to stay with us. So the way that God can stay with us is by giving us this ritual to purify the temple. So now God can stay with us. Good. There are no purification rituals for the entire land of Israel, however. If the land of Israel becomes defiled, it gets this terrible stomach illness, but there's nothing we could do to fix it. The only cure for the land of Israel's stomach illness is exile, which is why God is threatening it this way. There's nothing we could do. There's no sacrifice. There's no ritual. There's no sprinkling of blood. There's nothing. There's nothing that we can do. If the land becomes sufficiently defiled, the only choice that the land has left is to throw up its inhabitants. It already has done that with the Canaanites, or it's about to do it with the Canaanites from the real-time perspective of the book of Leviticus. But God is threatening the same thing could happen to the people of Israel. That the land of Israel has a low sin tolerance, and if you defile the land will have no choice but to spew you out, and there is nothing you can do to purify the land. Okay, that's just a very important point, which is going to also cover the rest of biblical history very powerfully. Okay, next. There are laws called Shemitah and Yovel. It's in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. In English, the English doesn't help much because they're just derived from the Hebrew. Shemitah is the sabbatical year. It's every 7th year where the land has to lie fallow. And the Jubilee, which is just an English version of Yovel, so that doesn't really help us. There was a Baskin-Robbins flavor, I think, called Cherry's Jubilee. And Jubilee has come to mean like festival and all that kind of nice stuff. But the original Jubilee is just Yovel. It's just the English, it's just an Englishism of the word Yovel. So these, and that's every 50 years where the entire land resets. Slaves go free, the land goes back to its original its owners. So there's no such thing as a real estate sale in Israel. You just have a lease. And the lease is over every 50 years at the Jubilee year. Okay? And the reason why God is so insistent on that set of laws is because God wants to remind the people of Israel that we don't really own the land. It's not our land. So source number 10, but the land must not be sold beyond reclaim, for the land is mine. You are but strangers resident with me. The Hebrew is ki gerim v'toshavim, exactly the same line that Abraham used as a foreigner among the Hittites. Well, the people of Israel should not view themselves as the landlord. Hashem, God, is the landlord. And the Israelites are resident aliens in their own land. And if we plow and plant on the 7th year and violate the sabbatical year, or we don't restore everything in the 50th year, in the Jubilee year, that's a way of saying we really own the land. And if we do that, God threatens exile for that as well. Right, which is the most severe thing that could happen to the people of Israel is being exiled from their land. All right, so source number 11, I just reiterated what we saw in an earlier source, that Abraham referred to himself as a resident alien among you. Okay, throughout the rest of the Torah, there are constant reminders that the land does not belong to us and that we could lose the land if we violate the covenant. That's something that God never tires of stressing in the Torah. I didn't even give you any passages in the Torah because they're everywhere. If you want the most dramatic of them, just the blessings and curses, Leviticus 26, and Deuteronomy 28. Those are the most dramatic of those, where exile from the land represents the pinnacle of all curses. That if you continue to sin despite multiple warnings from God and lesser problems, exile becomes the greatest problem of them all. Okay, so that's how the Bible rolls that out. And then in sources 12 and 13, we see that this keeps coming up even after the Torah. Source 12, Joshua at the end of his life gives one last speech to his people before he dies. Now they're already in the land, and he reminds everybody, now that we're in the land, if you break the covenant that the Lord your God has enjoined upon you, go and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you shall quickly perish from the good land that he has given you. It's his last speech to the people. He's letting the people know that even though we now live here, and we've distributed the land, we've conquered it from the Canaanites, the land still is always vulnerable to exile if we go ahead and violate God's covenant. Even when King Solomon dedicates the temple, okay, we're talking about how much more permanent can you feel in your land? By now you have a monarchy, the nation is united, everything is great. So source 13, God responds to King Solomon at this dedication of the temple. But if you and your descendants turn away from me and do not keep the commandments and the laws which I have set before you and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will sweep Israel off the land which I gave them. I will reject the house which I have consecrated to my name, and Israel shall become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Okay, that's pretty tough. And especially at such a moment, right? This is worse than a groom stomping on a glass at a wedding. And this is a very severe, ominous tone that God strikes. But it's all setting out the same point that the Torah already has. God's goal is for Israel to remain in its land forever through a mutually effective covenant. But if Israel goes astray and violates the covenant, they lose the land, they lose the temple. Okay? So that's how the Torah sets up its system, where the land belongs to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob no matter what. But we should always view ourselves as resident aliens, not as owners. And since God is the landlord, God can evict the tenant if the tenant is not living up to the bargain. Very, very simply put. And then on a much more colorful level, we saw the source in Leviticus 18, that the land itself becomes ill when it is defiled by sin. Okay, so far, so good. Okay, if the land doesn't belong to us, how can we lose it? Residence right can be lost like a tenant. Oh, there you go. We're all on the same page over here. The point is that God is the landlord, and God is allowed to say, you are unworthy of living here anymore. How did the Jubilee restoration to original ownership really work? Would ownership go back to the very first Jew who owned it? Were there records that this actually happened for how many generations? When it comes to did this actually happen, it's hard to know from the biblical record what was or was not observed on this score. But at least in principle, yeah, it's exactly what you're saying, Perry, that that Joshua distributed the land and there were family heads and everybody had an ancestral plot, and that was your family plot. And you bequeath that to your descendants. And so one would imagine that there was a very strong living tradition, because if you're living somewhere, I don't know if it was documented in writing or if it was an oral tradition, I don't know what they did, but you better believe that they took it very seriously. If you want one good story in Tanakh where you see how righteous of an obligation this was, you could look at 1 Kings 21, where the wicked king Ahab, or Achav, wanted to buy a vineyard from some poor fellow named Navot. They were neighbors. I mean, he wasn't poor in the sense of impoverished. He was poor because he's going to get killed. So he goes to Navot and says, look, I'd love to buy your field, and I'll give you a fair price. You know, I'm a king, I can afford it. It'll work out. Or I'll give you a better piece of land. I'm a king, I can afford it. It's all good. I just want this piece because it's neighboring to my piece. So I'd like to have your adjacent territory. And he basically says, God forbid. It's nothing against Achav here. It's just this visceral sense that this is our God-given land from the time of Joshua. And we've been holding this in our family for hundreds of years. God forbid I should give it to anybody. In Israel, you sell your land if you're destitute and you just need liquid assets. You need to feed your family. Okay, that wins. Then you sell your land, but you're not happy about it. But to just sell it as a land exchange, it wasn't real estate in the typical sense, the way that you and I might think about it anywhere else. Isn't Yirmiyahu also told to redeem a family plot? Absolutely. He most certainly is. It's Jeremiah chapter 32. So very good. I mean, that's a very important story also. I just like, I'm using Navot as an example because of the visceral, there's no way I would ever sell it unless I was destitute. And you even see how sad it is in the book of Ruth with Naomi having to sell her field It was terrible. So the whole family rallied around her and Boaz ended up redeeming it. That's what you do when you're family. You don't want that family inheritance to go out of your family even for a minute. Okay. So that is the sabbatical and Jubilee piece of the puzzle. And then we move on to the next thing, which is gratitude. The book of Deuteronomy in particular focuses on how imperative it is for the people of Israel to never take the land for granted, but rather to always be grateful to God. That sounds easier said than done, but most people, even back in the good old days, everybody complains, oh, today people feel so entitled. Back in the good old days, people felt entitled too, and it was wrong then and it's wrong now. It's not just a modern phenomenon, even if it might have modern manifestations. The Torah is extremely worried about Israelites becoming entitled, which means that obviously it was a problem. And the fact is the Israelites failed thousands of years ago. It was a real problem. So the book of Deuteronomy in particular really focuses on gratitude is the right thing and ingratitude, which is the wrong thing. I just gave you a couple of my favorite examples of this, but there are lots. I could have made quite a source sheet barrage just on this topic, but I'm trying to pick my favorite passages or most representative passages for each zone because, hey, it's a 1 hour session, not a 30-hour session. So you want to make sure to keep it simple. So source number 15 over here. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 8. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing, a land whose rocks are iron and from whose hills you can mine copper. When you have eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. In the Hebrew, by the way, the Hebrew is actually ambiguous. If you look at source number, not still 15, but just in the Hebrew, in verse 10 or Pasuk Yud, there's a verse that we say in the grace after meals, right? Ve'achalta v'savata ve'rachta. That could mean, just for the record, from a pure biblical Hebrew point of view, that could mean you will eat and be satisfied and bless God. In other words, it could just be a futuristic prediction, or it can be a commandment. You must eat and be satisfied and bless. Our sages took this to be obligatory, that this is a commandment, right? In other words, this is the commandment. We would say this is the positive commandment in the Torah to say the grace after meals, to thank God after eating a meal. Okay, the reason why our sages have to be correct on this one, as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik pointed out, is that the verse makes no sense in its context otherwise. Going back to the English, let's just look at verse 11. Right after, when you have eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Verse 11 now, in the middle of source 15. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God and fail to keep his commandments, his rules, his laws, which I join upon you today. And you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand have won this wealth for me. Remember that it is the Lord your God who gives you the power to get wealth, in fulfillment of the covenant that he made an oath with your fathers, as is still the case. In other words, never feel like you're entitled. Never feel that this is you doing this. It's all from God. So Rabbi Soloveitchik points out, verse 10 makes sense only as a commandment. If it's a prediction, then you don't need to warn Israel that they might become ungrateful. If the prediction is you will be grateful, great. So we're settled. But the fear is that you won't be grateful. Therefore, you must bless God. Okay, that seems to be correct. And the rest of the book of Deuteronomy revolves around this in a very big way, ongoing problem. The greatest hazard religiously for the people of Israel, honestly, seems to be wealth and prosperity. The fact that the land of Israel is a land flowing with milk and honey, with all these wonderful natural resources, that's a blessing. But the second we stop seeing it as a divine blessing and start seeing it as, wow, we're rich, we've really made it, that's the moment that we will forget God. And as soon as we forget God, everything unravels. So God constantly reminds the people of Israel simply to say our blessings, basically. Our blessings are meant to create exactly that attitude of, it's not ours, it's from God. And we are grateful to God for every little bite of food that we take. If we're able to do that, we'll never become ungrateful. Okay, swinging back over to traffic. Perhaps we can, okay, I'm not going into any political discourse right now, but all the same, yeah. The gratitude theme is a very important theme. And then we have this wonderful source 16, much of which we recite in the Passover Haggadah. This is talking about when farmers bring their first fruits to Jerusalem. And they have to make a proclamation of sorts as they bring these fruits. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with a meager numbers and sojourned there. But he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. You shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God. Okay, so this passage focuses on something that the Haggadah actually likes very much, which is one of the reasons why it probably uses this passage. It doesn't say that the Egyptians dealt harshly with our ancestors, or that the Lord freed our ancestors, or that the Lord brought our ancestors to this land. It's all us, right? The Egyptians dealt harshly with us. We cry to the Lord. There's an absolute identification between the Israelite farmer and the ancestors. There's no sense whatsoever that this story happened a long time ago. The assumption, the premise of this passage is exactly the premise of the Haggadah, right? That we are obligated to view ourselves as though we are experiencing the slavery and the freedom. That's exactly what this passage sets the tone for, which is why it makes an excellent model passage for the Haggadah itself. It's all about us. So this passage is about the ongoing sense that we are in our land because God redeemed us and God gave us this land. And that's, of course, meant to highlight the gratitude that we should feel as we bring the first fruits of our crop every single year, even many centuries after we've been living in our land. So the Torah is a very consistent picture. Just to summarize what we have over there, and then we'll just bring in a couple of modern thinkers. First thing is that God has made this covenantal land to Abraham and then through the descendants of Isaac and then Jacob from the whole book of Genesis. It is a central part of a God-Israel covenant. What wasn't clear from the book of Genesis is just how much we would need to do to stay in the land, right? The other books of the Torah are what pick that up. That there's a whole Torah here, and that the land of Israel can become defiled and ill when there are severe sins, and there is no way to purify the land other than exile. Just as the Canaanites are expelled because of their evils, so too the people of Israel can be expelled by their evils. The laws of sabbatical year and jubilee are meant to constantly inculcate the Israelite agrarian society that the land belongs to God, and that never for a second should we think that it belongs to us. Then you have all these laws and discourses on gratitude in the book of Deuteronomy, and simply drive that home. We always need to feel grateful every single moment, and we should even feel that God has given us this land, because obviously when it's a new experience, as something where we can much more readily appreciate it, as opposed to ever taking it for granted. Okay, that's the biblical survey for the day. I want to close out today's session with two contemporary thinkers who just add to the pot. One is Uriel Simon, who taught at Bar Ilan University for many years. It's in a book, it's an essay in a collection of essays called Jewish Biblical Theology. So Simon did not write the whole book. He wrote a chapter in this book, and here are some of the things that he says in this chapter. He wants to help us appreciate, I think, what the theological implications are of everything you and I were just talking about today, and it's a great way to tie it all together. The first thing to notice is that Abraham was not born in the land of Israel. He has no natural connection to this land. Right? God schlepped him over there when Abraham was 75 years old. So it's not a natural connection that our people have with the land of Israel. It is purely covenantal. And the only rights we have to this land are through this covenant. So this is not a natural bond to the land at all. There's no natural bond. It is a purely covenantal bond that we have with the land of Israel. Okay? The fact that Abraham has a rough time figuring out who his heir should be, that his heirs have to wait 400 years until they get the land, or even, what child is going to come out of this, all just drives home the point. The land belongs to God, and God is giving this land to the people of Israel as a covenantal, as a central part of this covenant. Okay? So Uriel Simon refers to this as a connection not of nature, but of destiny. So he tries to explain the mentality that we Jews have toward the land of Israel vis-a-vis how people who are just natives of any other country, how they think of their land. When you have a natural bond to the land, you're not worried about being exiled. You just live there. It's your land. It's your people's homeland. That's it. You take that piece for granted. Exile is not part of your land. When it's a land of destiny, well, God is going to keep on reminding us of this ominous threat of exile. The land doesn't belong to us, and the moment we violate the covenant too much, God can choose to exile us. That is part of the package from the beginning, even before the people of Israel enter the land. Here they are in the desert, as if they haven't had enough trouble in slavery. Well, now God is reiterating time and again, before they enter the land, your presence in the land is contingent on faithfulness to this covenant. Okay, so that's one fundamental difference between a natural connection to the land, which is not contingent on anything. You live there because it's your land, period. The people of Israel never had that. There is no natural connection to the land. The other side of the coin is that when somebody with a natural bond to his or her land is exiled, that's the end of the people. Right? When the Assyrians or the Babylonian empires came along and just exiled whole populations, it's not like you had Ammonites or Moabites in Babylonian exile. They just became Babylonians. It was over. They quickly assimilated into the dominant population, and the nation simply ceased to exist. And even if it was later re-inhabited, it was a different place. It was a different nation now. The people of Israel never ceases to exist as a nation, even without their land, because our covenant with the land is eternal, whether or not we are there. It's a covenantal relationship. So you understand the miracle of Israel's existence, today, very much derives from the Torah's philosophy that despite exile, the people of Israel never lost sight of the fact, but wait, the land still does belong to us. We're just not there right now. And God wants us to one day return to our land. That kept us as a people for 2,000 years in exile. And now we live in a miraculous age. May God bless Israel and all of its inhabitants. We live in an age where we have resumed living in the land, but that's simply what the Torah already envisioned 3,500 years ago. It's amazing. So all of the roots of that are from today's talk. It's really coming right out of what we've been looking at together. Simona just adds one other point, that when you have natural possession of a land, that deadens your heart to the land. You don't appreciate the jumpiness of it. You just take it for granted. It's simply part of your natural inheritance. Whereas a land of destiny forces constant attentiveness to God, or you lose it. As soon as we lose that attentiveness, we lose the land. Okay, so that's Uriel Simon's article in a nutshell in the book Jewish Bible Theology, which I think is very powerful. And I think, again, it just emerges directly from the sources that we have looked at. One other piece that I want to cite now from a recent scholar who died a few years ago. Hold on. Moshe Greenberg, who taught at University of Pennsylvania for many years and then made Aliyah and taught at Hebrew U. He died a few years ago. So he wrote a book called Understanding Exodus. And in Understanding Exodus, he just adds a few other dimensions that are worth noting. One is that God specifically gives the Torah to the people of Israel, not in the land of Israel. God could have waited and just said, here's the Torah. Let me reveal it to you in the land. No, the whole point is that the Torah transcends the boundaries of the land. So yes, there are certain laws, agricultural laws, for example, but other laws also that apply exclusively in the laws of sacrifices, that apply exclusively in the land of Israel. But the basis for the covenant is outside of Israel because it is wherever we are. Right? God did that on purpose to create an eternal Torah covenant with the people of Israel that transcends the boundaries of the land. And that's why after we were exiled from our land, it didn't occur to us to stop keeping the Torah. Of course we keep the Torah. The Torah is part of this eternal covenant that transcends the boundaries of the land. It's also important that the book of Joshua, where the people inhabit the land, they conquer the land and then distribute it, is not part of the Torah. The Torah ends just at the doorstep of the land of Israel, all part of the same reason. And it's also important that there are no holidays, it's amazing actually, that celebrate or commemorate or observe our entry into the land. Our holidays focus on Egypt and the desert. Right? We don't have holidays about entry into the land of Israel. That's also deliberate. And the idea is that our peoplehood and the God Israel covenant have to be apart from the land, even though the land is such a central aspect of the covenant. So Israel is the place, the ultimate place of the God-Israel relationship fulfillment, but we have the covenantal Torah relationship that transcends the boundaries of Israel. So I think that's also critical for understanding today, understanding where the Torah's narrative chooses to begin with the okay. When did was I off for a while? You all of a sudden I noticed that everybody was frozen, including me. I'm like, oh no.
15 seconds.
Just a couple seconds, Baruch Hashem. Glad to hear. Thank you. And the Torah specifically stops its narrative at the doorstep of the land of Israel, so that way the Torah can remain above the whole land of Israel peace. Okay. Until here, that, now let's see, traffic situation. What is the YouTube channel that your other classes are recorded? You should search the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. Okay, except a few years during David and Solomon, we've never possessed the boundaries listed by God to Abraham. Does that mean we've never deserved it? That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that question offhand. There are different boundaries of Israel that are presented throughout the Bible. You have the more modest boundaries that reflect real historical Israel, like where we were. And then you have this grand, greater Israel that really seems to go toward Mesopotamia all the way down to Egypt, which we almost never occupied. And it's unclear what exactly God has in mind with these more idealized borders, but that certainly was not the case 99% or even 100% of the time throughout the biblical period, where the boundaries were much more modest and reflected the more realistic boundaries that appear in the Torah and elsewhere, as opposed to these grand scale covenantal promises that for whatever reasons were not done. I don't know if that means that we did not deserve it. Could be that. But again, the Torah never focuses, and the Tanakh never focuses on the yet unclaimed land of Israel. It focuses on where the people of Israel are, their relationship with God, and at some different points where there are ruptures, where the people of Israel violate the covenant to the point where there is going to be some kind of exile. Okay. If you have any more comments or questions, this is a great time. Otherwise, I'll wrap it up in just a moment. There's a great time to do that. I like this chat function. I think it's great. I mean, I'm sorry that we live in, the situation that we live in. May God protect us all. But this is an excellent, it's an excellent way of getting together and learning with people who otherwise you would not be able to learn with. It's great to see old families, some old friends, some new friends. Okay, so let's get back to just summarizing these last 2 points. Uriel Simon focuses on the natural bond with land, which Israel is not, and the covenantal or destiny connection with the land and the differences between those two, and why the people of Israel never lost sight of the land of Israel. It's precisely because it occupies a covenantal role that we could lose, but always regain upon different circumstances. Moshe Greenberg just focuses on the boundaries of the Torah narrative, where the people of Israel began outside of the land of Israel and they end outside of the land of Israel in the Torah. And it's a means of showing that the Torah covenant itself transcends the boundaries of Israel, which is why we were able to continue living a life of Torah in exile for thousands of years. That never was a blip in our observance, or at least not formally. People understood that the Torah goes on eternally. Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, I will use this opportunity once again to thank all of you for coming. I'm so excited to be able to really just go into the biblical foundations of the God-Israel relationship, as opposed to whatever has evolved ever since, just really to look at the text itself. I see that I have more traffic. So I'll get back over to the traffic. I want to again thank the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals for sponsoring this series. It's a wonderful organization. Again, I thank all of you who are members and supporters. Those who are not yet, please again go to our website. You can learn more about it. The website is also on the source pages that you have received. And I thank all of you. Before we close out though, perhaps the borders of the land started off more broad and became more focused as the part of those boundaries that Abraham walked through, even though were later settled. It's hard to say because both sets of boundaries are in the Torah itself, long predating Joshua, even in the Torah itself. There are the ideal boundaries, and these much more realistic boundaries are both presented in the Torah before anybody enters the land. And so that suggests that the realistic boundaries are, at least for starters, that's what you expect. And then over time, it could grow. One passage where you see this explicitly, by the way, is with the so-called cities of refuge, the Arei Miklat, where Moses establishes 3 cities of refuge east of the Jordan River. Joshua then sets up 3 more on the west bank once they have occupied the land. But God in the Torah also says, and when God expands your boundaries, you'll set up another 3 also. So it's another one of these, did that ever happen? Beats me, I don't know. We never hear about those other 3 cities. But there's this sense that there are the realistic boundaries that we're going to start with. And over time, this could expand, but doesn't have to. But the Tanakh really doesn't focus on the failure to occupy more. It focuses much more on what we have. I get that we're under contract with Hashem to be good, otherwise we'll be exiled. However, alien resident strikes me as a negative term. Steward would be better. That's fine. The resident alien, in a legal sense, there's nothing bad about that at all. It really just means somebody who lives there but doesn't own it. A tenant. That's really all that it means. A ger toshav, that's what it means, a resident alien. So I think of aliens as people who inhabit other galaxies and stuff like that, who show up in cartoons now and who knows, maybe one day in real life also. But for our purposes now, there's nothing negative about a ger toshav. It's a perfectly respectable, excellent term. That's how Abraham viewed himself vis-a-vis the Canaanites, because again, he was not a landowner and he knew it. He knew that he was a foreigner who lived there rather than an owner, which is why he was stuck having to figure out a way to buy a field and cave to bury first Sarah and then later on the rest of the family. Okay, on that very happy note, I thank you all again for coming, and I look forward to resuming our learning with the prophets and that saga next week at this time, meaning from 12 till 1. Till then, I'll wish you all a Shabbat Shalom in advance and signing out. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
That was
Thank you,
wonderful.
everybody.
Thank you.